All right, everybody. Welcome, welcome. I am here with Derek, and I think we're going to introduce ourselves first. So I guess I'll just say for everybody listening, my name is Lance Bush. I do philosophy and psychology. I focus a lot on metaethics, and in particular, the psychology of metaethics, which largely explores whether non-philosophers are realists or anti-realists. I work on other stuff like free will and consciousness to a certain extent, but it's mostly metaethics. So that's what I do. Derek, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah. So, excuse me. My name is Dr. Derek McAllister. I do philosophy. So I don't do. This is a little bit of overlap here because I do philosophy of psychology, which is super interesting. Maybe we can talk about that. It won't be in this discussion, because we're talking about my what I normally teach on. But what I normally do research on is stuff like on conceptual models of depression. And everything related to that historically in terms of whether it be the deadly sin of sloth, melancholy, dark night of the soul, you name it. So that's what I did. And I did a doctorate at Baylor, and now I'm teaching. I just teach kind of around Baltimore area, and currently at St. Mary's Seminary University, and now in the spring I'll be back at Towson University. So that's me.
Awesome. All right. So what we're doing today is you reached out to me to have a discussion after, I don't remember if it was from comments I posted under the video or whether I did a video and you were responding to that. What prompted this?
I think it was. So I think probably a couple of your viewers found my videos before you did, may have flagged them for you or something. I saw them in my comments, them mentioning some legendary name, Lance, independent. And I was like, who is this guy? I don't know. And then you started commenting, and then you did a video after that. I think it's with the way it went chronologically. Yeah.
All right. So why don't you give us some context? So the main topic is relativism. That's what I think we're going to be talking about.
Right.
But there's a sort of surrounding like satellite issues that I think that we want to address related to this.
Yeah. And so relativism. Now we may be using this term differently. You may want to use the term subjectivism. Meaning like an anti-real, stance dependent. I was using the term relativism to mean basically more or less, I think, what you mean by anti-realism. So with hints of relativism in it. Maybe you can correct me on that if you want, if you can. But that's. So I was doing this again. The original video was something I would just standardly teach in classes. And go through. I've done it so many times to just go through what it is. And I do this. It's a meta-ethical theory, of course, but I like to do this in like intro to ethics class. I'll say, all right, we're going to go through all the theories, and so after this day or two on relativism, I'll do like here's the pros and cons of each, like ethical egoism, hedonism, utilitarianism, and so on, virtue ethics, and so on. So that we get the normative theories. But all that to say that this is sort of like a standard delivery. Like I'll give you like what the view is, maybe some things good about it, things in its favor, reasons why you might like the view, and then I give some objections later on. But the weird thing about this one is that, as I said in the original video, I'm pretty biased with respect to this. And although I am fair with students, I'm not going to grade them according to whether they agree with me. Certainly not. That'd be an ethical violation. I still have a lot more objections and concerns with this meta-ethical view than I do any of the other views that I go over. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, well, let me actually ask, did you see my discussion with Mike Humer, which is pretty recent, like maybe a month or a few weeks before that?
Not that one. I saw the one with David Enoch, and it was very good. Yeah.
So at some point in my discussion with Mike Humer, we ended up talking about our interactions with students in our class or our classes. I encounter, I think, the same thing. And I think that was where, I think Mike and I started to see that we had some similar experiences. And I don't know what your experience because, we teach in different contexts, different courses, different situations. But a very common thing for me to encounter with my students is for them to say that they're a relativist or a subjectivist, or to otherwise reject what they might call objectivity. They rarely would use the term moral realism, but this is super common. And it's so common that when I've sort of informally polled students in class, like show of hands, how many of you would say that you're a moral relativist? I had one class of 25 students. It was all 25 students. And I even pressed students. I was like, all right, well, I'll play devil's advocate here. I'll push against their views. I'll give them like, well, what if there was a culture where they practiced slavery or something like that?
Yeah.
Would you think it was morally wrong for them to practice slavery? And, there was one student that was real, like willing to argue with me about this. We took a few minutes. It wasn't a philosophy class. I couldn't spend too much time doing this, but it's important to clarify concepts in a psychology class too. And they were like, yeah, no, it wouldn't be wrong. So like they stuck to their guns even under pressure. And, so sometimes people don't, sometimes they do. But what I found is that probably throughout my classes, I would say somewhere between 80 to 100% of the students will typically endorse some type of at least they're calling it some type of relativism. So I don't know what your experiences have been like, but I think that's an important experience for situating this kind of conversation.
Absolutely. This mirrors my experience very closely. I think they walk in the door with some sort of relativism. They know not what. They picked it up. They don't know where. It's in the same thing with like utilitarianism. You hear along the way that, greatest good for the greatest number of people is probably the best way to go. And they're like, yeah, it sounds reasonable. It's not that they've read academic articles on this, or probably not even read the Wikipedia article on it, let's say. But it's this inchoate understanding. They don't get all the nuances to it, but they've adopted it along the way somehow. They couldn't tell you what it really is. And another important point is they don't necessarily always apply it consistently. So I'm actually impressed with the student you described, because he was applying it pretty consistently, and at least informed enough to where he's like, okay, I know what this is, I'm going to apply. But a lot of students still kind of go back and forth between what, again, terminology I'd call objectivist and relativist, without realizing that they're doing it. It's just like they don't realize that they're being inconsistent with their own beliefs.
Yeah, I've noticed that. One of my colleagues has done interviews with people about their metaethical views. Yeah. And one of the amusing things is when people in those interviews, at least after some time in the interview, would notice an inconsistency or a tension in their views, and they'd want to go back and edit or revise, or they'd pause and they'd express like, wait, so hold on. I said everything's relative, but if I'm saying it's relative and it has these implications, well, I don't like those implications. So dang it, what do I do? So you see people in real time noticing there's problems. So you get basically people that are consistent, but I still have questions about how sincere they are about that consistency. Like they might be, like I'm an anti-realist, so I'm sincere about it. So they could be. So you have people that may be superficially consistent, but I'm not so sure if they're just saying it's performative. You have the people that are inconsistent and don't even notice. And then you have the people that are inconsistent, but they only notice when you talk to them. And all three of those categories they're like basically a minefield of potential problems before you get to somebody that genuinely is sincere, is consistent, and really does understand the topic and endorse it. And I'm just not that sure that many people that I encounter out in the world really are consistent, sincere, fully committed anti-realists. And I say that as an anti-realist. I just don't. I'm very skeptical that there's that many. And I think that might be some common ground we could start with. Yeah, absolutely. I fully agree with that. It makes it fun to teach though, doesn't it? Like, it's like, you can actually kind of lead them through, it makes for really interesting class discussions, let's say, like, oh, it wasn't a problem. And, as long as it doesn't get heated and so on, it can be really, it's a nice way of the dialectic just becoming also a teaching point for everybody else, which is kind of what we're trying to do here, I guess. Yeah, I agree. And one reason I like metaethics is that it touches on so many other topics. It touches on issues in metaphysics and language and epistemology, in psychology, and it bleeds into normative and applied ethics at times because people give examples from applied and normative ethics. So it's one of those topics. I did have a friend who pointed out, like, if there's an area that touches on more, it might be philosophy of religion, and they made a very good case for that. But that might be part of the draw for me, is that it sort of brings all these different areas together, and I have these interdisciplinary inclinations. A lot of times though, I'm teaching psychology classes that are addressing these issues from a psychological perspective, and so that it's a little different than a lot of the standard like philosophy class experiences. Let me ask you something with respect to that, because I'm glad you flagged that, and I know you have some great philosophy background. You had, as you told me, some couple of philosophy professors, or maybe three on your committee, on your dissertation committee. For my dissertation committee, there are people that are either just they're philosophers, but many of them were cross-listed in both the philosophy and psychology departments. So they had interdisciplinary backgrounds, and that really fit well with my own interdisciplinary approach.
Okay. Good. So all that to say, you know your philosophy, which is awesome. But I wonder, so if you're coming from a neuroscience and a sociological background, a psychological background, if that in any way kind of, I mean, you wonder which direction of causation, cart before the horse kind of thing here is. Does that color the way that you think about these metaethical things already? Because you're already in the soft sciences, discerning these things, you kind of already assume that it should be done a certain way. Does that kind of close possibilities to you that would otherwise be open if you're doing this in philosophy?
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. Probably, yeah. So just to clarify, so the specific area is social psychology. So there's like all these divisions. I don't do neuroscience or sociology.
Okay.
There are these like technical distinctions between the different areas, and there are some of the distinctions are pretty important. I don't know much about neuroscience. So social psychology, but you know, my approach started forming very, very early. So I did a bachelor's degree. I don't know why I did this, but I have 2 separate bachelor's degrees instead of one dual degree. But I have 2 bachelor's degrees, one in philosophy, one in psychology. And so even before I went to grad school, I was already approaching things from a sort of dual perspective.
Yeah.
And when I was at Tufts doing my master's in philosophy, I was also in the Boston College Morality Lab. So I also was continuing to do, you know, empirical stuff. And that continued when I went to Cornell to do the psychology PhD, is that I continued to work with and address philosophical issues from a psychological perspective. So it's hard to say there isn't like a one before the other experience that I had. If we go all the way back, I was taking philosophy courses before psychology courses, but that was so early on in the way I was thinking about things that they basically, like, you know, in like those trees that they wrap around each other, they started growing together very early for me.
Got you.
So I would not, so I don't approach things as like there's a philosophy hat and a psychology hat. Sometimes I'll use that metaphor just to be goofy or whatever. But for me, the 2 fields are so thoroughly fused on my perspective that I don't really know how to do one without the other.
That makes sense.
But if the question is like, does some of my training in psychology potentially bias or cause me to have a somewhat blinkered perspective? I certainly think that's a possibility. I always had a more empirical bent, and I think I have basically a sort of natural empiricist disposition.
Got you. Okay. Yeah, that was what I was wondering. Are there many in social psychology that are moral realist? I think you had something about the statistics on this when it comes to philosophers in general. That are most are more realist, but are there many at all who are doing social psychology?
There's no significant data on that. Okay. So the big data that we have for philosophers is the Phil paper survey. There's the 2009, and then there's the 2021. Okay. And the 2021 is the most recent, and that has 62% of philosophers endorsing moral realism. Now it's worth noting that they had specific ways that they gathered the data. I think it's about half of the participants are in the United States. Gotcha. And so it's giving you a largely, although not exclusively, a perspective on the Anglophone philosophical world, and in particular, analytic philosophy. Of course, yes. So I don't think they're getting as many people with a continental philosophy background or other philosophical traditions. So it's like more leaning towards.
They didn't ask me, so it's got to be anyway. So
they didn't ask me either. You know, it's a funny thing. I don't know if I come up on a list of people that count as philosophers because the PhD's in psychology. I don't know. Right. So even though I publish in both fields, you know, who knows what I count as? But so that found 62%. But I've never seen a survey of the views on metaethics of people outside of analytic philosophy. They did recently do a survey. Basically, they gave the Phil paper survey to, I believe, analytic philosophers in China, and they were looking at differences between exclusively Chinese respondents to the survey, but they were people that were specifically analytic philosophers in China. So it's not really giving you a perspective on people that practice other philosophical traditions. Right. So that's the only thing we have. I have no idea if most social psychologists are moral realists or not. My guess is most don't really understand or know much about the distinction. But if you were to ask them, I would expect a lot of them at least nominally to give anti-realist responses, but I don't really know what proportion would.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It just all ties back to this idea that, you know, we're going to see the most students, at least, that we teach. And I would venture to guess that most college students in general, especially if this is their first philosophy class, are going to be along these lines of a anti-realist / relativist, however you want to scrape that together, you know, some inchoate view. And I'd probably venture to guess maybe the population at large is, but that's why I wanted to ask about academia outside of just this narrow analytic philosophy that studies, you know, was it just about metaethicists or ethicists that they polled, or was it all analytic philosophers, or
all the philosophers that responded to the survey, which again was mostly analytic philosophers.
Yeah.
If you go into that survey, they have like an interactive version of it online, and you could filter by specialization.
Yeah.
And so if you look at the metaethicists, I think I can recall the exact number. I think it was 228 metaethicists responded to that particular question. And the proportion of metaethicists that endorsed moral realism actually went up from 62% to 65%. So
Okay.
if you narrow by specialization, it actually slightly increases.
Interesting.
Who knows if that is a meaningful difference? But yeah, that 62%, by the way, also went up from 56% from 2009. So it's some indication that the proportion of realists may be increasing among analytic philosophers, and that metaethicists, like specialists in the topic, are just as likely, if not more likely, to endorse realism. But again, we just don't have data for people that are not professional philosophers, or I guess you could say lay people.
That seems to track in the literature with the decline of materialism in general, in metaphysics and philosophy of mind. That would be my only guess is why the number has increased since 2009. You'd have a lot more philosophers of mind, metaphysicians, like jumping back on to say pantheism and panentheism, you know, in order to explain the hard problem of consciousness, for example. I don't know how, I mean, because these are all intertangled, you know, discussions and fields and so on. So you mentioned earlier how it does overlap quite a lot with metaphysics. So could it have something to do with that? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think so. So I think if we look at what philosophers that have been around for a while say about what the status of realism and anti-realism were, my general impression, and again, I wasn't around, so I'm just going by the impression I've got from what philosophers that were around in the mid 20th century say, is that it looks like anti-realism was absolutely dominant in the early half of the 20th century. And this, my guess is that this had a lot to do with the prevalence of logical positivism.
Right.
And
I would guess so.
Yeah, like immediately following like this sort of linguistic turn, there was this deeply skeptical take that dominated the field. And to me, it's always looked like there might be affinities with the prominence of behaviorism and psychology, but I'm not a historian. I haven't dug into that. But there's something about these really metaphysically stark, cut it all, prune everything away type views, where the first half of the 20th century, they were really dominant. And then something happened around the 50s and 60s. You have several things. You have the fall of behaviorism as this, like, being in the limelight. I think a lot of behaviorist motivated research has continued to go on, but you have Chomsky publishing his critique of Skinner's verbal behavior. You have the cognitive revolution. There was this turn away from these stark empiricist views.
Yeah.
And I think that might have ushered in a kind of resurgence in like a rationalist renaissance or something like that. You do have, though, other movements specifically in metaethics. So I think it was around the 1980s where you had naturalist realism step onto the stage. And then you had this like second wave of realism, which is the non-naturalist realism, which looks to me, again, I'm not a historian, so I'm speaking from very, very, I don't know, vague sense of what I've seen. That looks like in the 90s with Russ Schaefer Landau and several other people, that non-naturalist realism started to step back out into the light and reassert itself. So that's what it looks like. It looks like it's been about 30 years of non-naturalist realism sort of undergoing a revival. I don't know what your take on all that is.
That seems right to me, and I'm glad we just solved it just now. No, but that roughly, I'm glad we're on the same page with the at least the narrative. Very, very broadly speaking, of course, this is just a survey of things. But yeah. That seems that I think as far as like the highlights and why things would change at the times they changed, that tracks really well. Yeah.
Right. So, the popularity of realism, I don't know what to make of that. I mean, one thing worth noting is that you could actually split the realist respondents to the survey by naturalists and non-naturalists, and the naturalists are a little more common. It's about 1/3, and the non-naturalist realists are 26.6%. And anti-realists are 26.1%. So if you're just comparing non-naturalists and anti-realists, the difference is negligible. It's a 0.5%.
Interesting. Cool. All right. Well, where do we want to go from here?
Well, so we've kind of gestured at this, but I think I'd like to pin down what we're talking about when we talk about relativism. And so far, I think we've been talking about, I guess what I would say, it might be, there's like at least 3 tiers we could talk about. We could talk about relativism in the general population, relativism in academia, but outside, like the insular tower of academic philosophy in particular, and then you have specifically the academic forms of relativism. That's at least how I see it. Is that there's at least those 3 levels. What about you?
That seems right to me. Are you wanting to wonder like which is it that I'm, at least in those videos, was responding to?
Yeah, maybe an amalgamation, or maybe something in particular. You tell me.
I think, to be fair, I think that each one of those objections that I gave could be split up. I could have arranged it, and not simply in terms of individual versus cultural moral relativism. That is who it's indexed to, but I could have arranged it in terms of, appraiser versus agent relativism. Like, to see maybe some of those objections are going to, address one of those, but not the other one. So, but it's not clear when you're reading through these. It's funny because, it's like, well, if you say if you have identified in yourself a certain view that you hold, you're like, you could read through that whole list of 10 or 16, however you want to count them, objections, and think, well, all of these don't work except for maybe number 3 and number 8 or something, right? And so it's like, well, yeah, because that's the ones that are like more tied to that specific one. So I don't think each objection was, there's a little bit of equivocation, let's say, right? So I could be clearer in saying, all right, now this specific objection number 2 is going to apply to both the cultural kind, it's going to be agent relativism or something, so I could have done that, but it's like, if you're, this is why if you see on the original handout where I'm discussing in the first video on just saying what the view is, at first I give this a really confusing characterization. I try to flag like, hey, this is just a characterization. This is not a definition. You'll get a definition later. But I think pedagogically that's helpful. It's like, all right, you guys are familiar with what I'm talking about. Let's sort of ease into this. But if you were to start with students, you're going to say technical definition, right? If S does X with Y circumstances at T time, like, you're going to lose them right away. Right. So I do give some of that. If you see in the first video, later on in the handout, I don't talk through the technical definition, but I have it there on the handout for reference if the really aspiring, ambitious student wants to look at it and think about it. But there, as you probably know, there are very few of those. So I try to keep it at very it's unfortunate, but when you're teaching pedagogically, just kind of not, I don't think surface level is the good right term here, but I try to keep it as simple as possible. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, it totally makes sense. I mean, I am self-conscious of the fact that I can be nitpicky and say, hey, there's actually 3 different orthogonal distinctions here. You can combine them in all different ways. And so there's like, if you do the factorial, there's technically 16 different combinations of the possible views here. And that, I don't think that might, whatever. But that.
Here's the question. Why wouldn't you do that?
Well, so there's 100 good reasons to do that. 1 is the video would be 5 hours long.
Right.
2 is no one would watch the video.
Right.
3 is exactly the target audience you want to present that video to. They're not going to be, they're going to tune out for exactly. Yeah. It take a person P at time T and do exactly that kind of formalism. But also not even if you're just being formalistic, but if you just give too many distinctions, especially when they cross cut one another, where it's like, well, you can have appraiser and agent relativism, and you could have individual and you could have cultural relativism. But technically speaking, since all of these, technically speaking, relativism is not the same thing as stance dependent. So you could really have stance dependent accounts that are relation designating, but not relativistic. And you could have relativistic accounts that are technically stance independent. And it's like, well, but okay, but nobody actually endorses that type of relativism, a stance independent. I've never met anybody that endorses it.
You could make a 12-page handout where you're being really, really, thorough and precise. And this is what a lot of the scholastics in the medieval period did. Right, you're very, very thorough, making all these distinctions. Very, very helpful if some really ambitious researcher wants to go through and look at it. But your general audience, you're just going to lose them.
Right, but where my concern comes in is if someone then just goes around saying relativism is wrong, and what if you think version 7.2.6 relativism actually holds up pretty well in light of all these criticisms, and all the other ones have problems? Well, okay, so what about that one though? And so if you endorse a view that's adjacent, because I'm not a relativist, but I endorse what you might think of as like a relativism adjacent views. And so I often find myself in common cause with defending various types of anti-realist positions from critiques that I think can give a misleading impression. So, I think it's perfectly possible to be a consistent relativist of certain stripes and not be subject to certain sorts of self-defeat objections and other sorts of objections. And so while some forms of relativism or ways in which an individual might endorse relativism in conjunction with other views might be subject to certain sorts of criticisms, I don't know that, I wouldn't necessarily generalize and say, therefore, relativism fails.
Right.
So you have this tension here between oversimplification and overgeneralization.
Right. Absolutely. I'm glad you raised that with respect to the, I think you raised this, or maybe it just popped up in my own head. We can go back and watch the recording and see which happened first. But I think you might have mentioned the incoherence or something. Maybe you were thinking about the same thing I was in terms of the first objection, because I did read or watch part of that second video where you're discussing that first objection that I have, and that is logically, or that it's incoherent or self-defeating or something like that, which would imply that it's logically self-defeating. Logically self-referentially absurd or incoherent. And I think you're right about that objection, because you had said that's not a good objection because there's a metaethical claim. You have that first order and second order objections. But to clarify, there are also different forms. I mean, this is why metaethics is so wonderful, because you get into now you're in philosophy of language, right? So there's all different forms of incoherence. In my view, there's logical coherence, of course, practical incoherence. And I think there's also moral incoherence. And that's what that was aiming at. And I don't think I elucidated all that well. But if you were to interpret that in terms of logical incoherence, obviously it's not self-refuting, logically speaking. Yeah.
Right. But a person could have a self-refuting position in metaethics if they're a global relativist and if they're trying to make a non-relativist claim about metaethics. So if a person says, look, all truths are relative, and they are technically committed to the view that it's a non-relative truth that morality is relative, they've got a problem. So that would be a logical issue. And
that's right.
I actually have met people that were global relativists and then didn't want to admit that. So I ended up asking one of them, like, okay, well, if you're a global relativist, then you're wrong relative to my views. And then they were like, well, no, I'm right. Like, no matter what anybody's view is. And I'm like, hold up, but you think that everyone is right relative to their views. So I'm right relative to my views. So relative to my views, you're wrong. And they were like, no. And I was like, it became this thing. It just went into this loop. And I'm like, look, I'm just saying you're wrong relative to my views, according to your view. You're still right relative to your views. And they were insistent, no, that they were right relative to their views, and I was wrong relative to their views. And I was like, I don't think it's a have your cake and eat it too situation.
Right.
So that I've encountered that. I've witnessed that. And I've probably witnessed that more than once. So that does occur, the logical contradiction. But if you were referencing a moral incoherence, could you maybe clarify what that objection would be?
Yeah, it would be something like this. So the idea is that, let's see. I think what it means, let's say, I have some of my notes here. Maybe we can cut some of this, Lance, or leave it. It doesn't matter. I think that when you make a moral judgment, it presupposes moral. When you make a moral judgment or perform a moral action, let's say, I think it presupposes more reasonably moral objectivism rather than relativism. And this is, I think, just pragmatically speaking, because this is why, or at least presupposes that other people around you know what the heck you're talking about and what you mean. So if I were to say, murder, is that?
Yeah, murder's fine.
Okay, murder's an okay example. All right, if I were to say murder was wrong, it's understood that you're going to I understand what I mean by that, and you're going to so to use an example here, if I said let's go play soccer, right? So this is a claim. It's actually like not just a claim, it's not descriptive, it's more like an imperative, but something like let's go play, right? Is ordering or welcoming you to go play soccer. But if you were to show up with, I don't know, a deck of cards and start playing, that, and I'm like, what are you doing, right? It would seem that you're like, well, if you were to answer, well, I'm playing soccer, like relative to me, this is what soccer is. That seems to undermine the whole idea. That's not soccer at all. It seems that when you were discussing with me let's go play soccer, and you agreed to this, whatever, it seemed that we both understood what it was. So I think this is the way with moral claims and moral actions. When you do these things publicly, it's understood that you're going to have some agreement about them. And I think it presupposes, I think it's better explained, or that it presupposes, however you want to put it, I haven't thought through this clearly, moral objectivism better than, or let's say realism better than anti-realism. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't think so. So, I mean, one, you have just straightforwardly, there could be contexts in which, I don't actually think this is the case, but if you imagine everybody was a cultural relativist, they could get into arguments or disagreements about what is morally right or wrong relative to their culture. So, one person could say abortion is wrong, another says abortion is not wrong, and they could have a dispute, and they could both literally just be cultural relativists, because there is a fact of the matter. It's fixed by their culture, but there's still a fact.
Yeah.
But there's like constructivist accounts that can make sense of these disagreements, and then just sort of very standard, straightforward anti-realist accounts. So, I'm an anti-realist, and I could tell, like, I don't go around withholding moral judgment on things or not expressing my moral standards. My moral stances are stances on what kind of world I want there to be, how I want people to act, what I want people to do and not do. And when I come into conflict with other people, those conflicts concern conflicts about people not doing the things I want them to do. So, if there's a fire, I'd want to put it out. If there was, depending where it is, if a house is on fire, if there's a fire, I'd want to put it out. If there's a person that wants to steal, I don't want them to steal. And so, people act on their goals and interests, and they don't have to think that the conflicts that they come into with other people are conflicts over what's objectively right or wrong, or stance independently right or wrong. They can just have conflicts over their interests. And, I frequently give examples like this. Imagine you and a group of friends are trying to order a pizza,
right.
And you're trying to figure out what toppings to get on the pizza. And, you have the vegan friend and the friend that's like, oh, I'm trying to cut back on cheese. Can we do a cheeseless pizza?
Yeah.
No, we're not doing cheeseless pizza, but they want a cheeseless pizza. So, you got the one person that loves mushrooms and the person that hates mushrooms. So you have all these people and trying to figure out, all right, we're going to get a few pizzas for the group of, say, 10 friends or whatever. It's not like there's a stance independent, like normative fact of the matter about what pizza toppings you should get. It's a matter of negotiation. And so, I would say that you could have a whole argument. Oh, we got mushrooms on the pizza last time. It was nasty. You could imagine people arguing about it. So I would characterize that as a disagreement.
Hold on.
But
sorry, continue the thought, and then I'll want to.
Yeah. So I would characterize that as a disagreement, but it's not a disagreement where there's any presumptive stance independent normative fact of the matter. The disagreement is one about coordinating actions and getting people to be on the same page with respect to their goals. So, that's pretty consistent with a lot of anti-realist views, non-cognitivist views, relativist views, my views. And so that's generally how I see moral conflicts in society, as clashes of goals, values, or interests, not clashes of beliefs about the truth of a given set of propositions. So I basically think a lot of these accounts wouldn't have a whole lot of trouble handling these kinds of conflicts.
Okay, so if you you said negotiation, why negotiation? So I know you're using an example of taste, but this is how relativism goes. I think we both agree on that. Relative to me, and then relative to you, we're going to have disagreements. And if having to make a collective choice or a choice that involves both of us, it needs to be a matter of negotiation. I'd say that doesn't exhaust the possibilities, either negotiation or conflict, right? Like I have to sort of impose my values or something like that. But why negotiation as opposed to conflict, let's say?
Well, it's going to depend on the context, and it's going to depend on the values and interests of the person that would consider negotiation or not negotiating. So, like speaking for myself, you know, if I'm trying to decide, like my wife and I want to go get dinner, I like my wife. I want to get along with her. I'm not going to be like, we're going to go where I want, and we're going to, or you know, or nothing. We're going to figure it out. Like maybe we take turns picking movies or where we're going to go to eat, or, oh, well, we went there last time, or, oh, I'm not in the mood for that. You know, we navigate that. But if I'm dealing with someone that says, you know, hey, let me inside your house so I could steal all your stuff.
Right.
No, you're not coming in my house. It's a matter of negotiation. Now, if they're like, oh, I got a flamethrower, you better let me in. Okay. Now I might let them in, but that's because they're changing the value matrix for me, like the payouts, the incentives. They're not convincing me of what's true or false. So, you know, for me at least, whether I decide to negotiate or to fight it out would depend on the context. It would depend on who I'm dealing with, how likely it is I think that negotiating will work. But generally speaking, what's driving a willingness to negotiate and not always fight is one, cost-benefit analysis. Like sometimes fighting is actually the worst option from a completely self-interested perspective. And two, my own values. I don't want to fight with people unless I have to. It's a last resort for me. But that doesn't entail that it would be that way for others. So there could be like, I don't know, some space aliens could just have zero pro-social interests at all when it comes to members that aren't of their species. So they show up, and we're like, hey, let's do diplomacy. And they're like, no, we're going to conquer your planet. There's no having a conversation with them. You know, if it's like Independence Day or something like the movie, they're not interested in chit-chatting. They're just going to wipe us out. In that case, there's no point in trying to negotiate with them. So what I would say is this is driven by self-interest and values.
Okay. Those seem to me moral decisions, negotiation versus conflict or fighting, right? So I'd say that to choose one over the other itself would be a moral choice, not just weighting cost benefit, pragmatic decisions. So that you're making, and you kind of reflected this in saying that which reflected your own values, you know, whichever one was most closely consistent with your own values. But this seems to me like a deeply moral thing, and it seems to, I don't know. For me, it points to realism about things rather than because if I were to press you right on this alien invasion, of course you wouldn't like that, and you wouldn't want to evade you, right? But then they're going to, and you would resist. And why would you think that? Why would you think? Okay, we gave two choices: negotiation, fighting. Why not just lay down? Why not just be compliant the entire time?
Well, it's very simple because I don't want to.
It's not
because I think that what they're doing is wrong.
And you also said this with respect in one of your videos, and this gets into the appraiser relativism. You said that, you know, some cultures, they get obliterated or subsumed or something, you know, with coming in and wiping out languages or something. I think you mentioned this last video, cultures and so on. And you as an appraiser want to say, well, that's not good. I wouldn't like that. I wouldn't want that. But like, what weight does that have behind it for you to just say that? Are you speaking as an individual, like this is just, or cultural, or like, do you think these things are really true? Or are you just being performative? Or are you just like, well, this is according to me. Why should I listen to you according to you, unless you're wanting to be really strong and enforce that? You see what I mean?
Yeah, I absolutely do. Yeah, I don't think that my claims carry much weight. So I think the thing is, it's not just that I don't think my claims carry weight. I don't think realist claims actually have any real weight behind them. I think they have a presumptive or a aspirational weight. But if someone were to say, like, let's say it turned out moral realism were true, and there were these stance-independent moral facts, and we had some method of knowing about them. Well, if those stance-independent moral facts conflicted with my values, unless I could be somehow persuaded, if that were possible, to change my values, I would not comply with those facts. So, you know, I think it's logically possible. Maybe you would disagree. Some people might disagree with me about this, that the stance-independent moral facts could be, you know, from my perspective, pretty atrocious. They could hold that I should kill certain people or I should torture certain people when I very much don't want to and think that would be bad relative to my own values. And if those were what the moral facts were, I would say, well, too bad for so much for the moral facts. I don't care. So, the stance independent or realist moral facts purport to have some sort of authority or weight, but I don't see it. I don't think they actually do have any weight or authority. They sort of verbally present themselves as having weight or authority, but I could just opt to not comply with them, and nothing happens. Like if I just break those rules, so what? Nothing happens.
Well, I think the same thing could be said in anti-realists or relativists, however you want to construe this. We should get clear here in a minute on like what your view is, so that I'm not kind of So at one point in the first video, you had said it may not be a matter of decision or choice. If if you're an anti-realist, I think you were speaking in terms of your own view here. You may have no control over what your views. I think this came in the context when I said, and you were right about this. I love that you point this out. You said it was like more rhetorical than anything. It was like, instead of discovering, it's like inventing. That was totally rhetorical. You're right about that. But it is a standard characterization. But an anti-realist, let's say, invents the more. But to that, you'd say, well, you may have no control over what views you adopt or not. This seems to be put the anti-realists in the same position as the moral objectivists, because if you have no control, say an objectivist has no control over what views the moral views are. Like they have no control over which ones are true and which ones are not. It's up to them to discover it. The anti-realist seems to be in a similar boat with respect to that. It's like, if I'm just getting these, let's say, non-cognitively, I didn't go through this epistemically ideal agent scenario where I assessed all the views. I mean, who does that? It might be in the same situation that many of our students are in. You just sort of adopted these things, not just the normative theories that we're talking about, but actual claims with respect to like, oh, maybe I just grew up thinking it's okay to torture babies. So, I mean, that's just relative to me. That kind of puts me in a really bad spot. You see what I mean? And this,
what bad spot does it put you in?
Well, it mirrors the same troublesome spot that you just identified for the objectivists, I think. To recap, I think, correct me if I'm wrong about this, you said the objective view could be something like, let's say the real view could be something like, it's wrong, or sorry, it's a good thing to do X, Y, and Z, and we recognize those as bad things. I have no responsibility, no reason to follow along with that. I can just disagree. Let's not disagree. But I don't want to adopt the real view, let's say. So I'm just going to dismiss it, whatever. In other words, you have this sort of deep aversion to saying that what morality is saying is okay. Now I want to put you as not. So there's you as the viewer right now in the story, and then there's you in the story. Okay, so you in the story, let's say, grow up, you adopt some view that you as a viewer right now understand as morally abhorrent. Does that make sense? Like,
sure.
In the story, you grow up this view where you just like think it's okay to torture viewers, to torture babies. But you, as a viewer in the story, you're thinking, no, that's terrible. That would be terrible. I wouldn't want to do that. But that seems to be a wrench for the non-realist, the relativist, to throw in and say, because you could be put in a situation where you're believing things that you now would be like, no, I don't like that. So I guess it just comes down to that, right? I don't like that. I wouldn't prefer that. I'm not approving of that. And yet, so the question, the rub is this: how do you know that's not the situation you're exactly in right now? That otherwise, if you'd had a different upbringing, that you would find the views that you currently hold as morally abhorrent.
Yeah, I certainly think I could. If there was a different contingent historical circumstances, I could just have a different set of values. And what would happen under those circumstances is, like, if the me in that world that thinks torture is okay was thinking about like the Lance in this world that thinks torture is bad, I'd be saying, oh man, well, there could be a version of me that's against torture. That would be terrible. I don't have a problem with that. So I just take these to be descriptive facts. So I wouldn't think the current me is correct in any non-relative way relative to that other version of me who's incorrect. I don't think there's any absolute perspective. Basically, I don't think there's a perspective outside of this world, like Lance in World 1 or Lance in World 2 that's pro-torture, I don't think there's a perspective outside or above either of those perspectives from which to judge or adjudicate any of these disputes. That version of me would think the same thing about this version of me.
Yeah.
And I don't think either of them is more or less correct with respect to any sort of objective standard.
Right. So we differ about that because I do think that there's so if you follow along with view on transcendentals, and this gets back to the idea of like non-materialism, you have like a real metaphysical robustness, view where you have transcendentals such as the good, the true, the beautiful, and so on. And of course, later philosophers in the Middle Ages, like Augustine and Aquinas, are going to identify these, or at least find them located in God, in the mind of God, right? So if you, the relativists, of course, would say, well, that's not objectivism, that's relativism with respect to God. Like he's just saying that relative to me, these are okay. I'm actually okay with that, if that's what you want to say, but that to me, it's pretty much a wash at that point. It's sort of, it comes out, input, output. Now you've got objectivism. Like you can call it whatever you want, relativism with respect to God, but that's basically what I mean by objectivism, or let's say. So at that point, I would say, I would probably agree with you that there's no stance independent. I would just say, well, the stance would be God at that point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I've heard characterizations of divine command theory that make clear that it is technically a realist position. If we want to get really technical with stuff, Richard Joyce, he's an error theorist, he's an anti-realist, has this great little supplemental section he had on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry, I believe it was on moral anti-realism, where he draws a distinction, which I've alluded to before, between, I'll use my terminology rather than his terminology. He uses more of the I guess mainstream terminology that was used for a few decades, and I guess I'm using the neo terminology.
Right.
So there's two distinctions here. One is between relativism and non-relativism, and the other is between stance independence and stance dependence. I take, and this again, I'm trying to characterize Joyce's characterization using my own terminology. Joyce characterizes relativism as the view according to which the truth of moral claims is indexed to different standards. And this allows the truth status of any given moral claim to vary in accord with which standard it is indexed to. Now, I know that sounds super technical. I don't know who's going to be listening to this, but it's actually a technical distinction that everyone is going to be super familiar with. Yeah. And so what are indexicals? They're something you use every day. In fact, I'm using them in this very sentence. So like terms like I, you, me, that, them, we, these are all indexical terms. And what that means is, like, if I say I am Lance, that word I, what makes it indexical is that it indexes me. The way that the word I works is it refers to whoever's using the word. So if I say I am Lance, the statement is true. And if you said I am Lance, unless you have a secret identity as Lance, that statement is false. And so that same statement, I am Lance, can be true when I say it and false when someone else says it. And there's no contradiction there. Because I refers to me when I use it, and it refers to whoever's using it when they use it. And so the meaning, what I is referring to, changes. And that's not the case for something like if I said 2 + 2 = 4, or well, that's a good enough example. Triangles have 3 sides. Triangle isn't indexing anybody when it's being used, or anything. So indexed language, relativism just says, okay, well, when people say things like murder is wrong, it's kind of like in little parentheses, they're saying, according to my standards. And see, there's the index. So they're implicitly indexical, and that allows the truth status to vary.
Right.
And a non-relativist view would say moral standards can't be indexed. And so the kind of view that you're describing, where the moral claims are in a certain sense dependent on God, well, there's only one God on such views, presumably. There's one God, and all of the moral facts are true according to the standards of that God. And so, well, now when people make moral claims, could they be indexed? Could the truth status vary depending on who's using them or who they're referring to? No, because there's only one standard. And so Joyce calls those, he cites somebody else, calls them relation designating accounts. And those accounts, while they are technically stance dependent accounts, they're not technically relativist accounts. So sorry to get into the technical stuff, but that's
totally fine. How he characterizes this helps because I found that, so if we're going to refer to the Joyce reading, I have it pulled up as well. As I was reading through this, and again, the terminology, I don't know if I'm agreeing with you or him. I know I'm not agreeing with him, because I found out when just been looking at the different polarities that are orthogonal to each other, I realized that when he's using the term absolutism, it means something like universal, applies universally. But that's not the way I was using it. I was taking it without exception.
Me too. Yeah. That's why I don't like his terminology. Absolute has this use in normative ethics to refer to exceptionless moral rules.
Right. And then he was using the term subjectivism. So he talked about subjectivism versus objectivism polarity. I was just using, so he used that to mean indexed or mine or stance independent. I was taking subjectivism in the term of being a form of relativism.
Me too. I use subjectivism, I think, identically to you, which is a form of relativism according to which the truth of moral claims is indexed to individuals rather than groups.
Yeah. Okay. That's the way. So when he says there's two polarities, one is subjectivism versus objectivism, I would just take that to mean, probably relativism versus objectivism. But then he gives the different polarity as being relativism versus absolutism, and then I become confused, because he's using absolutism as a what I would call objectivism, or
right. So as far as I understand, he's using objective to mean stance independent, subjective to mean stance dependent, relative to mean indexed, and absolute to mean non-indexed. And so the orthogonal distinction is, are moral claims indexed or not indexed? And the other is, does their truth depend on people's stances or not? And they're two technically separate things. The weirdest one out of these would be if you're a relativist that's a stance independent proponent, like a realist relativist.
Yeah, I think you're right.
You could be a realist relativist. And people have asked me for examples. And the one I've settled on giving people as an example is if you thought that moral standards are made true by what a person's astrological sign is.
Yeah.
Like technically they're true independent of a stance.
So here's the thing. So I would, unless I'm misunderstanding you, this seems to me to sounds like what's going on when we talk about situational ethics, in the sense of, like I was saying, you can be an absolutist, that is, you can be an objectivist in his terminology, or stance independent. Again, this is assuming, stance independent. I would include in stance independent, stance dependent if you're God. That would be, I guess, if that's going to be the bifurcation there. I would say you could be that stance independent and also be somebody who's a relativist in the sense of indexing certain truth claims to individual cultures. In this sense, well, I guess not to individuals or cultures, but it would be indexed to circumstances, and that would be situational ethics. Does that seem right to you?
Yeah, I would call that something, you could call that contextualism or something like that. I see that as a different distinction. So that's,
I wouldn't say
index the truth of the claims to contexts.
That's hard to use as a term, contextualism, because it's used in epistemology in a different sense, but
it's used in a million different cases. Yeah. I don't know of a good terminology to use for that.
I thought it was just situational ethics. I could be wrong about this. So that varies by the situation. Or the circumstances in that case. So that would be, and I know you commented on this with respect to, I wouldn't say varies by the circumstances. I would say index the person or the culture or something like that. But I do think that it could be indexed if you wanted to use it. If this makes you a relativist, I would resist that terminology. But because again, assuming that it's not stance or mind dependent, it's not going to be how I feel, but it's going to be variable with respect to what the circumstances are or the situation. So this is the example I gave. You could be, in my terminology, an objectivist, not a relativist, that is, and still be someone who thinks that there are exceptions.
100%. Yeah. I mean, this is a point I make in my own writing all the time. This is a common misconception you get from students and people in general, where they think that they conflate realism, or the view that moral facts are stance independent, with the moral rules have to be exceptionless. And that is 100% not true. Nothing about, like, you could think this, you could think, look, moral facts have nothing they're not made true by people's stances. You could say it's a fact that you shouldn't steal unless conditions A, B, or C hold. Like you're stealing from a person that's about to commit a terrorist act, or you're stealing from a person in order to like get a medication that's going to save everybody's lives, and the person is selfishly hoarding it for themselves, and blah blah blah. There's a whole bunch of circumstances where you could say certain moral principles or rules are overridden, or the circumstances allow one to deviate from a more general rule. And you could say, yeah, and all that's true independent of anybody's attitudes or stances.
Yeah.
So they're just different from one another. They're not the same sort of thing.
To be clear, is that a view that you hold? Can we talk about what your view actually is?
Sure. Yeah. So I see the situational considerations as a feature of normative ethics, not metaethics. So I don't know which one you want to talk about.
Okay. So let's get clear. So you say that you will defend the relativists, but again, I want you to say exactly what you mean by that, because I've been using relativism in a specific kind of way that you may not be sharing. So just what do you mean by, I know that, obviously your channel, your stance independent. So you're anti-realist, that much I can get so far, so good. But you say you're not a relativist. So what do you mean by
not
that?
a relativist? Sure. So the standard positions, as I understand them, are relative. Like the standard 3 anti-realist positions are relativism, error theory, and actually, I shouldn't even say relativism. The standard 3 positions, in my terminology, would be stance-dependent cognitivist accounts, error theory, and non-cognitivism. So the reason when I say I defend relativism is that, more broadly speaking, I will defend anti-realist views against what I take to be overgeneralizations or misconstruals or rhetorical objections. Any case where I could potentially clarify the sort of anti-realist landscape in a way that is helpful to people and illuminates what's going on with these positions, I'm going to do that.
That's really helpful.
Yeah. Now, people could criticize me for failing to come to the defense of realism when anti-realists make bad objections to realism, and that would be fair. I don't do that, and there are instances where I see people taking swipes at realism that are very ignorant and ill-informed, and I don't come to the defense of realism. Maybe I should start doing that more. So these standard positions, the standard 3, and this is very consistent with the way Mike Humer presents them in Ethical Intuitionism.
Hold on, you say you gave 4, is that right? Or you said,
there's 3.
You said you shouldn't say relativism, so non-cognitivism, cognitivism.
Yeah, I don't use the term relativism because technically relativism is consistent with realism. So I would use the term stance-dependent cognitivist accounts.
Okay.
So these are accounts that hold. So I'll start with those because I'm using proprietary terminology here. I'm actually mixing.
That's fine. As long as you're clear about what the terms mean, I think that people can understand. So
okay. So stance-dependent cognitivist accounts hold this. Okay. When people make moral claims, those claims can be true or false, and some of them are true. And what makes them true are people's stances. That's it. Now, what does that include? It includes most forms of relativism, including cultural relativism and subjectivism. Sometimes I specifically say individual subjectivism, just to make it very clear. I'm talking about relativism at the level of the individual.
It's redundant.
And it includes,
it's redundant in that case, right? You're not trying to make a distinction.
Right. Yeah, it's redundant. Yeah. But sometimes it's just helpful to just throw that word in there when I'm worried my audience isn't going to know that I'm drawing a distinction between relativism to the individual rather than relativism to the group.
Okay.
But it also includes a variety of more complicated accounts. I usually omit these, and I think most people omit them when they frame the stance-dependent cognitivist accounts because of their complexity, which are anti-realist constructivist accounts.
Right.
And the constructivist accounts all hold that there is some set of procedures or set of principles according to which we can determine what the moral facts are, but ultimately our stances play some essential, ineliminable role in that process. So constructivist procedure.
View?
Yeah. So as
why,
long as the stances fix the facts, then it's still anti-realist.
Oh, I see. Okay. So it's still anti-realist. They're not real. That makes me wonder about what real means then.
I didn't pick this terminology. I didn't pick it. So, like people
will
sometimes,
but they're not real. But sorry, hard to interject.
I even have a couple blog posts about this where I complain about this terminology because there are anti-realists that would say, well, of course I think morality is real. I think it's real and relative. And then there might be anti-realists that are nihilists that say it's not real. So like having the category be morality is not real doesn't make sense because some of them would say it is and some would say it isn't. So, but I didn't pick the terminology. we could look if we could get all the metaethicists in a room and get them to agree to use consistent terminology that accurately represents the positions. I pay a lot of money to see that happen.
Yeah,
I haven't done it.
That'd be nice.
Okay, so these constructivist positions, what would be an example of them? Maybe the most standard example people tend to give is ideal observer theory. And so the way this position works is you say, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to say that what's morally right or wrong is what a perfectly rational and fully informed version of us would endorse. Whatever that hypothetical being would endorse, that's what's morally right or wrong for us to do. Now, they might think that there are facts about what we would all, facts about rationality where we would all converge in extremis and we would all converge on the same view. And so there's a single moral standard for everybody to conform to, but it's the standard of a hypothetical agent. And the facts about what makes it right or wrong are true according to what that being, that hypothetical agent would endorse. Technically speaking, that makes the facts stance dependent because they're made true by a stance.
Like God, I'm just it's hypothetical.
Yeah, it does. It is a lot like God. Yeah, it's very much a lot like God. Yeah, sure.
Well, so I'm wondering about this. So how is this still an anti-realist view at that point? Because it's like, well, this hypothetical observer is going to have some, let's say, I mean, it does assume that there's a tight connection between morality and rationality, which all ethicists, hopefully it'd be nice to always have those converge, but they're not always going to go. Like Kant was like, yeah, everything that's supremely rational is going to be, that's going to be what's moral, right? But like not all ethicists or anybody are going to agree with that. So this is a view that assumes that, and so the ideal rational observer, right? Because you can't put it in moral terms, not ideal moral observer. Ideal rational observer would be someone, but there's got to be an objective ideal rational observer. So then let's say a real, right? Wouldn't that just be the real? It's weird that we're using this terminology again. What is real? But let's say objective. There's going to be some objective, ideal, rational something or other. And so that's just what objective morality is. Boom, solved it, done. That's realism. Why how is this still an anti-realism view? Can you explain?
Yeah, the reason for this is that technically speaking, where the discourse has moved is characterizing realism versus anti-realism in terms of what it is that makes moral claims true. And this is how I use the terminology. Not everybody's going to agree with this. So the way I use the terminology and the way a lot of people in the contemporary literature do, so I'm not doing anything particularly idiosyncratic here, is that they characterize realism as the view that there are stance-independent moral facts. And so the question would be, in the case of ideal observer theory, are facts made true by stances? Are the moral facts made true by stances? As far as I could tell, yes, they are. They're not made true by anybody's actual stances. They're made true by a hypothetical stance, but they're still technically true or false depending on the stance that this being would take. And so because what serves as the truth maker, what it is that makes a proposition like murder is wrong true, is that the ideal observer would hold that it's true. And so it's actually technically made true by a stance. Now, in practice, does that function very much like realism? Yeah, there's a single set of standards. You don't get to decide what those standards are. Those standards are rationally binding on you. Looks like realism, but tactically speaking, stance dependent. So if someone wants to say, okay, but that is in spirit and in practice indistinguishable from realism, yeah, pretty much. But tactically speaking, it's a type of anti-realism. That's just because we've decided to draw an arbitrary line where these are the independent accounts, these are the dependent accounts. That's just how people decided to use the terminology. They could have carved it up in a number of other ways. I'll make one simple point about this. The naturalist realists, a lot of them see moral facts as being simply descriptive facts. So facts like murder is wrong would just mean something like murder reduces well-being. Well, that's a descriptive fact. That has no authority over anybody. And that, to me, is so much closer to my type of anti-realism than ideal observer theory. Why is my position lumped in with ideal observer theory, which is like rationally binding and blah, blah, blah. But the naturalists are lumped in with the non-naturalists, even though their position have no practical authority. So I don't know. So, this is a point I made with Mike Humer, although I don't think I expressed it very well and I've written about it before, but the naturalist realist accounts, a lot of them seem to me closer functionally to anti-realism. And then a lot of the realist accounts that in the anti-realist accounts in the constructivist zone look a lot more like realism. But I didn't pick the distinctions. I'm just
exactly like
clarifying them.
It sounds dangerously, teeteringly close to being a theist, but not wanting to be a theist, right?
So I would agree with that. You would have to go back to find some of my discussions with theists, but I think a lot of the impetus, like the motivation for non-naturalist realists, look at where non-naturalist realism arose. It came to prominence with G.E. Moore, 1902 or something, and it enjoyed this resurgence in the past 30 years among secular, analytic, moral philosophers in the Western world. What have we seen in the secular West? A decline in Christianity and monotheistic religion more generally. Almost all, it's like 70, 80, like most philosophers are atheists. They're like massively disproportionately represented as atheists. And these are people that have been steeped in, over 2,000 years of monotheism and a couple thousand years of Christianity in particular, which has closely integrated Western philosophy into its fold. And so I think these people are absolutely swimming in Christian influences. And look, if you want my take on it, I think that cultural zeitgeist in which they're operating is totally influencing secular moral philosophers. I think they're reaching for a God that they don't see there. That's what I think. I mean, maybe that's my hot take, but I just agree with theists when they say this.
Well, it's more than a hot take, and we'll get back to you explaining the things, but I think the response to this, especially for somebody who is a presuppositionalist, with respect to like an apologetics position with respect to Christianity, they'll just say, hey, you guys are borrowing from this without even attributing, right? You're using it, and then you're trying to explain away or rationalize away. Yeah. But that's neither here nor there, of course, because that was constructivism.
Yeah, certain types of constructivism.
Okay, so
there's more comfortably anti-realist forms of constructivism. Yeah, not my view. This is not my view.
We're getting to
a more comfortable version. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. We're getting to your view eventually. But
Well, I have to say what my view isn't to say what it is.
Of course, class, of course. But super helpful. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, to exhaust that category of stance-dependent cognitivism, they really should call it that. I'm going to call it that in my writing, and too bad if people don't like it.
Stance-dependent cognitivism.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and cognitivism, for people that aren't familiar, is just the metaethical view that moral claims are propositional. They could be true or false, rather than them being like expressing emotions or imperatives or something, or exclamations like "murder, boo." Okay, so. There are these more comfortably anti-realist constructivist positions like Humean constructivism, and on that view, you might say that that moral facts are determined by what you would endorse under certain reflective conditions. I don't recall exactly how Sharon Street characterizes Humean constructivism, but on these views, what this allows is for a moral anti-realist to say, "Oh, I could be wrong about what my moral values are," and what they might mean by that is they might say, "Look, I go around the world. I'm not fully rational. I'm not fully informed about everything. But if I were more informed and I were more rational, I would have a better understanding of what is genuinely consistent with my fundamental motivations and drives. I could discover that about myself. And so I could discover all along that I was wrong about this particular moral claim that I used to go around making. And so they could be wrong about what their moral standards are. And yet they're still an anti-realist. What they're wrong about is they're wrong according to what they're genuinely committed to and what they would think under certain conditions of reflection or awareness.
And this is back to like people don't hold consistent beliefs. If they were to be pressed on these things, it would reveal the truth. Yeah, it does presuppose this sort of depth psychology, there's an inner you and so on and so beyond what you're saying. I get that. Yeah.
Right. And so this has some advantages over more crude, because most public discussions of relativism, the type of relativism is super crude. It's like very surface level. You've got desires. So if it's right or wrong, if it's according to your desires, and that's not how human psychology works. Like just take someone that's struggling to stop smoking cigarettes, and they go out and they smoke one cigarette. They haven't had one in a month. They don't smoke any after. Good for them. But if you ask that person, did you want to smoke that cigarette? The answer is not yes or no. The answer is, yeah, I really wanted to smoke it, and hell no, I didn't want to smoke it. And they kind of wanted both at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
it's not a hard presupposition to prove, but that's the presupposition she's using. Totally consistent with our experience.
Right.
So, okay.
So that's the stance-dependent cognitivist accounts. The other ones will be quicker on. So non-cognitivists may say that moral claims aren't even in the business of being about what's true or false. The standard versions would be emotivism and prescriptivism. And these basically say, look, it might superficially look like grammatically, like when you say murder is wrong, you're making a claim about what's true or false, but really you're saying like murder, boo, or don't murder. They can't really be true or false. And so they don't think there are any moral facts. because of that. And then you have error theorists that say, okay, look, when people say murder is wrong, they're trying to describe these objective moral facts. It's just that there aren't any moral facts. And so all of those first order moral claims are systematically false. Now, those two you could lump in into a super category of nihilism, because both of those views would say there are no moral values or facts, or like on one view, there's moral like emotions or moral demands, but there's no moral facts. And then on the other view, again, no moral facts. There's people are trying to say that there's the moral facts, but there aren't any. So people might liken that. It's basically error theory is like atheism for morality. It's people think that there's a thing, they're all wrong. So, for an atheist, if a person goes around saying God wants this, God wants that, all those claims are wrong because God doesn't want anything on the atheist view. And it's the same thing with error theory. People go around saying murder's wrong, murder's not wrong. All those claims are false because nothing is right or wrong. So those are the three views. Now, when I look at those views, if you look at the history of those views, actually, I guess I should pause there before I get. Do you want to jump in? Because I got out all the other views, and I could say what mine fits in with this.
So to recap, and this is helpful. Maybe we can like cut it up to where I marked the time here. 59 is when you began discussing this, and this is super duper helpful. Maybe done other videos on this and whatnot, but so the three types of anti-realism are: 1, constructivism; 2, non-constructivism, in which you have the emotivism, non-cognitivism; and then 3, error theory. And why is it called error theory? Is because people can make these judgments, they're just being wrong about them.
Yep, that's exactly why.
Why is that not? Okay, because those are truth conducive, right? They're
right.
Okay, why? Okay, well,
it's error theory because everybody engaged in moral discourse is systematically making erroneous claims.
But they're still. So does this entail that all moral claims are necessarily false?
Yes. Yeah. All first order moral claims.
Yeah. That's bizarre to me. Yeah. But then why even call them like, what is the word? Truth conducive or something?
Well, they're capable of being true or false in principle. It's just because of the metaphysical facts they turn out to be false. Kind of like, I wouldn't say that the claim God exists is like, it could be true. It could be false. And if you think it's false, that doesn't mean that you don't think it could be true or false.
Gotcha.
Now, that might actually be a problem for people that think that God's existence is necessary, because then you might say, no, it's not possible that it's false.
Yeah, that'd be a problem.
But that I don't even know how. I don't know how theists. I don't do philosophy of religion, so talk to them about that. I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah. Okay. This is super duper helpful. Not just for me, I'm sure for many people. So, okay. So that summarizes that, and you were going to continue. Go ahead.
Right. So my issue with all three of these positions is that they all center what the anti-realist position is, their particular form of anti-realism, on a semantic thesis. That is, while they make metaphysical, like all of them have the metaphysical thesis, there are no stance-independent moral facts. That's what's required for them to qualify as an anti-realist position. So they all share that same metaphysical thesis. They may have other metaphysical theses as well. What they all share in common is that they all say something about what moral claims mean. So the stance-dependent cognitivist views say moral claims can be true or false, and they're true or false depending on our stances, and how they cash that out depends on the view. The error theorist says when we make moral claims, we're all making claims about what's stance independently or objectively right or wrong. And then the non-cognitivist says when people make moral claims, they're not saying anything propositional. Now, those are all claims about what people mean when they make moral claims. Right. They're semantic theses. I think all those theses are wrong because I don't think language works in the way that seems to be shared by these views. So they all seem to think that there is, as a matter of analyticity, a category, the moral claim, and that moral claims, in virtue of being a moral claim, share certain semantic characteristics. And so if you're a non-cognitivist, you think moral claims as a category are claims that are non-propositional. If you're an error theorist, you think moral claims, like what it is to be a moral claim, is to assert something propositional about what's stance independently right or wrong. And if you're some stance-dependent theorist, you'd say the same thing. If you're like a standard individual subjectivist, you say, okay, when someone says murder is wrong, that means something like murder is inconsistent with my moral standards. Now, the problem is, what are they talking about? So, when they're saying moral claims have this characteristic, I like to ask people, which ones, which moral claims?
Right.
So that can sound real weird if you think that there are like moral claims almost, what makes something a moral claim is like a conceptual truth, because it's not a matter of any particular instance. It'd be like if someone said, hey, 2 + 2 = 4. And I said, which 2 + 2 = 4? Like, that's a silly question. Yeah. It's a conceptual truth. It's not it's not like, that yeah. 2 and that 2, they add up to 4. But what about the 2 and 2 over there? Do they add up to 4? That's a goofy question to ask because it's a conceptual issue.
Right.
So if you're treating this as a conceptual issue, I have a problem with that because I don't think there is, as a matter of analyticity, a category, moral claim that shares these specific features. You could stipulate a category, but I don't think that there is one in some metaphysically or conceptually deep sense.
Gotcha.
So when I look at moral claims, and this is where you could say, hey, that's your psychology coming in, biased or not. Yeah. I see moral claims. I see claims as behaviors, as events that occur in the world. So, and those events don't have to have the same characteristics. So for example, imagine a person shoves another person. We could ask the question, are shoves necessarily unethically hostile acts of aggression? That doesn't make any sense because you could shove someone because you want to hurt them. You could shove them off a cliff. You could also shove someone to get them out of the way of a bus that's coming towards them. And that's a good shove, like, yay, good for shoving them. And so it wouldn't make any sense to treat all shoves as having a specific intention behind them, as if that's an analytically like a feature of what a shove is. Like shoves are to save people or to hurt people. Shoves can be to help. Shoves can be to hurt. Right. I see moral claims very much the same way. When people make moral claims, they are doing one of any number of possible things, and it's an empirical question what they're actually doing when they make those moral claims. So I see all moral claims as instances or events that occur in the real world, and I don't think there is some floating category moral claim that exists outside of them. So the whole approach of 20th century metaethics was to analyze these decontextualized sentences that no one was actually asserting, and to figure out what the sentences outside context of usage mean. But this is where my views about language come in. I endorse a language's use view. I think sentences, claims, utterances only acquire their meaning in their context of usage, and they mean whatever the people in that context are using them to mean, and that meaning can vary. And so because it can vary, there's no singular fact of the matter about whether any one of these semantic theses is correct or not. I said a lot there. Does that make sense?
It does. Follow-up questions, of course. So you say there's no category for these moral claims. They themselves would just be sort of, not to use the word performative in a bad way, but they would be performances. They would be instances, events that happen in the world. But what status those moral claims have? They would just not have a truth value then? How is that not emotivism?
Right. So it depends on what's going on in the context where a person is using it. So trivially, let's say I'm talking to a moral realist and they say, hey, look, we're at an academic conference. I'm telling you, Lance, I'm a non-naturalist realist. When I say murder is wrong, I mean that there is a stance-independent moral fact according to which murder is inconsistent with, like, it's wrong. What am I going to do other than say, okay, well, when that person says murder is wrong, they're clearly speaking like a realist. Of course they are. Because I think that what they mean is fixed by the context of usage, like what they're trying to do, and they're trying to speak like a realist. So I'm fully willing to grant that person speaking like a realist. And the same would be true for any other philosophers at a conference that are very explicit and clear about what they're trying to say. But then we have ordinary usage. And when you go out in the world and you look at what ordinary people are doing, I take that to be an empirical question. And this is where my empirical position comes in. It's called folk metaethical indeterminacy. I don't think in most instances when people say things like stealing is wrong, that determinately fits any of these analyses better than any others. So this is a position that comes from the philosopher Michael Gill from a paper from 2009 called Indeterminacy and Variability in Metaethics. And I kind of just took that idea and ran with it. And that's what I wrote my dissertation on.
Cool. I was wondering if I was going to ask you, and I want to be careful with that. I was like, I don't want to just say bad things about his dissertation. I knew that you were so deeply informed by this. It's like, this is something that's probably his dissertation or adjacent.
Yeah. This is what I wrote my dissertation on, is examining the empirical evidence. Basically what I did is I looked at all the studies that try to elicit people's metaethical views, and I present evidence that the people in these surveys are not understanding the questions about metaethics the way the researchers intend. And this has been my experience in person. Yeah, they don't know the independence, dependence difference, and they're not responsive to that in the way researchers want. Now, to be clear, I am not saying that this is because ordinary speakers are stupid or ignorant or incompetent or anything like that. I 100% don't think that. What I actually think is that everyday speakers of language are like language is incredibly sophisticated as a technology. It's super duper cool. So much of it is implicit. Children are speaking when they're very young, and our language capacities increase as we get older. But language is like this marvelous invention that is so nuanced and sensitive to context. And so what I think is happening in these studies is that philosophers have very narrow and specific ideas in mind, and they're presenting language that is outside the everyday context. And so people have to try to figure out, what is this researcher asking me?
Right.
And there's just not enough context. So I actually think this is a researcher problem, not a research participant problem. Basically, I think that researchers have too much background knowledge, and they're providing people with situations with impoverished context and then demanding a specific answer. Kind of like if I said a person shoved another person, was it good or bad? You would have to act like, in most cases, it's probably bad to shove people, but like, what was that specific person doing in that specific case? I can't judge one way or another. I see the exact same thing with moral claims. If a person is committed to realism or anti-realism or neither one, you can't know without examining the specifics of the case. As one last metaphor, if you wanted to understand animal behavior, let's say tigers, I don't think it would make any sense to go look at some tigers at the zoo, go home and imagine tigers, and then think about imaginary tigers and say, I'm going to figure out tiger behavior. You'd have to study specific tigers. It also would make a whole lot of sense to study tigers in a zoo, because their behavior is not reflective of how tigers behave in the wild. If you want to know how tigers behave in the wild, you need to go observe tigers in the wild. And I feel the same way about moral claims. If philosophers really want to know the empirical questions about how people use moral claims, they need to actually study how people actually use moral claims, not sit in their armchair and say, take the sentence murder is wrong. What does that mean? Well, who's using it? What's the context? So that's my general take on it, is I think that there's these big language issues in the methods that the standard anti-realist views depend on. And I think they're totally destructive to those.
It's not just lack of terminology, it's lack of distinctions too. And this is what academics are really good at. So like, if let's compare like the weather, if a meteorologist was like, well, we're going to go around, we're going to survey people. If they say cloudy, what do they mean? Right? Like, you're going to lack so many distinctions, like what kinds of clouds, like partly, like over, what do you mean by these things? And that's where academics can come in and say, well, we're going to stipulate this by this term, this by this term, this by this term. And so, it does become like a gatekeeping thing. It's like, well, these individuals need to learn, but then in psychology also, if you inform them depending on the kind of analysis and study you're trying to do, you don't want to inform them too much because you won't get like authentic results, right? So they're like creative ways to like kind of go around and circumvent, right? So like, you don't want to inform them too upfront about what you're talking about. So it's kind of a catch-22, right? But you want to be on the same page about terminology. But then if you were to survey people who just were already using the terminology, well, that's going to be people with a certain background. So if you want to get the common folk, and then it becomes a discussion of like, I try to stay away from like the power dynamics. It's like, well, socioeconomically, they're going to be, there's like now there's a tension in between, who should be using whose language and stuff. I try to stay away from that. I think the ones with more distinctions, where distinctions are appropriate, right? In the example I gave, like maybe it's more appropriate if you want to be more fine-grained in your analysis of what clouds are, what do you mean by cloudy? But like in the everyday, like it depends on what kind of study you're doing again, but in the everyday, it might be totally sufficient.
Yeah. There's so many extra distinctions to make here, but the issue here isn't simply that I'm drawing extra distinctions within the standard dialectic. It's that I'm rejecting the methodological and substantive, like psychological and philosophical presuppositions that I see as fundamental to the standard characterization of the standard three views. And so because I reject what's lurking kind of behind those views, I can't accept any of those views. For comparison, imagine an atheist being told like, look, you have to pick, you have to decide whether you're a universalist or not, or something like that. They're just going to be like, I'm not any of these. I can't pick any of these.
Right.
So that's very much where I stand in relation to these views. And so then the question is, okay, well, what is my view? Pretty straightforward. I don't think there stands independent moral facts. And then I just don't endorse a specific semantic thesis, or at least the semantic thesis isn't like the anti-realist view isn't directly contingent on the semantic thesis. So I don't think there stands independent moral facts, but I don't endorse a specific semantic thesis. Yeah, so you could call it neutral anti-realism. I prefer to call it anti-realist quietism, at least for now. And so the anti-realism reflects that I'm taking a stance on whether there's stance-independent moral facts. The answer is no. But I'm a quietist about the standard characterization. So I'm like a partial quietist. So basically, like quietist views are motivated by, hey, this dispute is actually like it's not a legitimate dispute, so everybody shut up and stop talking about it. I kind of feel that way about the semantic dispute. I don't think there's a semantic dispute, so given my views about language.
So the quietist part shows up between you could find yourself in any of these, unless two or three, all three camps.
I don't find myself in any of those camps.
Like,
And I don't,
depending on like the claims, I guess. Like you could assess these claims like, oh, they could be assessed this way. Or are you saying, because you said it was neutral, so it could be any of these in the sense?
No, that's not what that's not
the
sense in which I'm neutral.
Right,
so technically speaking, if a person is very clear about what they intend to mean, there would be determinate instances of usage. That's why I gave the example of a person at an academic conference saying, I'm speaking like a realist. What I would be an error theorist about what that person is saying. So like you could say, I conditionally endorse all three of these views in certain circumstances, but like the circumstances are instances in which there's a distinguishably determinate usage of language. So if a person says, I'm a relativist and I'm going to speak like a relativist, I'm going to think that person's probably incorrect. If they say I'm speaking like a realist, I'm going to think they're incorrect. If they say I'm speaking like a constructivist, I'm going to think they're incorrect. So I'm going to be like an anti this or a pro that when people are very clear. But I took the standard positions to be characterizations of the meaning of moral claims, not the meaning of specific uses of moral claims. So I don't think there's a fact of the matter about what, quote unquote, moral claims mean. Like, okay, let me put it in simple terms. I don't think there are analytic truths about the meanings of moral claims because I don't think that's a category of thing at all.
Empirical descriptions of events and behavior and so on.
Right. And so I can't take a stance on something that requires an assumption about meaning that I don't hold, which is that these views, I think, presuppose that there are facts about what sentences mean that are true independent of usage. And so if you endorse a language's use view, it's impossible to endorse one of those views. Now, someone could say, oh, well, I'm a non-cognitivist, but actually I agree with you about language. All of these positions could be reconstrued as empirical positions about what most people mean or something. So you could say, no, I take non-cognitivism to be an empirical claim. And as a matter of fact, most people are just expressing emotions and they mean oral claims. Then I would just say those positions are false.
Right. Gotcha. Okay.
So, but see, I'm sorry to make it complicated. It's complicated because
it's helpful. No, it's helpful.
I've asked philosophers, like, when you're talking about non-cognitivism, is that an empirical claim? And when I sort of informally surveyed people, I got about 50-50. So I'm like, I don't even know anymore.
So in this, keeping in the spirit of this sort of going, if I were to do a study going to the actual people who use these terms or the everyday person, right? What would you characterize your own view in everyday person language then? Because we've said it in the technical terms, right? Like, so what would this look? You can give me several. You can give me like 3 or 4 options here. But like, if I were to try to explain this to my grandmother, let's say, what the heck am I going to say? Can I explain this sort of nuance?
Yeah, I think so.
The everyday person, what would they do about this?
So I think I'd say something like this. I think I'd say, okay, there's this big dispute among philosophers about when we make moral claims, like murder is wrong. Are those claims true because we hold them to be true, or are they true regardless of what we think about them? So you might frame it something like that. And you could say, okay, so they have this big dispute. And then there's all these people that say, they're not true, independent of how we think about them or what our attitudes or opinions are. But all of those views presume that everybody speaks and thinks in exactly the same way. They don't. And so all those views are wrong.
Okay.
Maybe that's not the best way. I'm trying to keep it short.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So what's left then? Of course, if I'm a grandmother, supposing I could think like a grandmother, what's left then?
I don't think there's much value in...
what are we doing when we say moral things? We're just actions that mean nothing then? Like, what's the point in doing it then? Because I think be somebody who says, I wouldn't do that. According to me, relative... I don't know if this was characterizing, you were self-characterizing here when you were saying something like this, but I wouldn't do that. Still, presumably, you would want to say you have your own views, and at the applied ethics level and the normative, claims and so on. So, what's the point, though? Would this be a nihilistic view then, or
that could be? But that's not the view I take. My view on the indeterminacy and why I reject these positions is consistent with being a realist. So there's a paper.
I think
moral
right. Yeah. So I want to ask you. Go ahead, but I want to ask you also why prefer the anti-realist over the realist in that case if it's consistent. But yeah, go ahead, sir.
Yeah. So the paper is called "Must Metaethical Realism Make a Semantic Claim?" It's by Guy Kahan, and he argues no, it doesn't require a semantic claim. And so I actually think realists too should abandon insisting on cognitivism as a feature of realism. And so standardly, moral realism will be depicted as a cluster of claims. I usually just say it's the view that there's stance-independent moral facts. But if you see realists characterize the position, they'll also often say, I'm a cognitivist, so I think moral claims are true or false. And then they might have like an alethic thesis. So they'll have a cluster of theses like, I think moral claims can be true or false. Some of them are true, and they're stance-independently true. So, and they might even add an epistemic feature like, and we have access to at least some moral knowledge.
Right.
So they'll make it a very robust view with a bunch of different components.
Yeah.
I don't think they need that semantic view. I don't think they need cognitive. I could ask you this. Like, look, let's say you're convinced that I'm right about the philosophy of language. I'm not saying you are, but let's say you were, or someone hypothetically was. And so they think facts about what people mean are determined by usage. And then let's say we go and do an empirical study and we find out 99% of the time out in the world when people make moral claims, they're just expressing their emotions. Mm-hmm. Would you abandon moral realism because of that?
Okay, say it one more time.
So imagine we find out that 99% of the time...
To take the antecedent here and still be moral.
Right, no, I get it. I understand.
Yeah, but so I can get myself in that mindset because this is really...
So we go and we do an empirical study. And I don't think this would happen. But if we did, we interview people, we survey people. And turns out, as a matter of fact, all the students in our courses, all the people in the street, 99% of the time, when they say stuff like murder is wrong, they just mean like murder boo. They're just expressing emotions. Mm-hmm. No, nothing else is changes. It's just most people, most of the time, are speaking and thinking like emotivists. Would that make you go, I guess moral realism is false?
Absolutely not. They're just wrong.
See? So I would say, if I was a realist, I'd say, oh, well, then everybody's incorrect.
Right.
I would say they're using language I guess that's what people mean when they're making moral claims, but they're very misguided because there's these moral facts out there that they don't know about.
This is possible and to still be an anti-realist.
Yeah, you could be a realist, you could be an anti-realist. I don't think that our metaphysical views should be so contingent on how non-philosophers happen to talk. That's weird.
No,
they could just be wrong.
I absolutely agree. Yeah, this is why I find little value. It's helpful, as supplemental information, but beyond that, it's little value in going out and surveying people how they use language.
I survey people to argue about why we shouldn't survey people.
Yeah. It's a good way to argue. They're going to give terrible responses. Your average person, who is it? George Carlin, who says, think about how stupid the average person is, and then think about how that's the average person, and half of them are stupid.
Yeah.
Right. So you want to put little stock in that, and that's not to be elitist, right? He's giving this comedy joke not to elitists, but he's saying the average person. So you don't want to put too much stock into everyday usage. Yeah.
Right. And so I think that recent analytic philosophy has just become obsessed. It has an unhealthy obsession with language. And I think that this cuts both ways. Although I have a whole dissertation arguing that most people are not moral realists, I maybe seemingly paradoxically do not take that to be good evidence against realism. Because I think whether realism is true or not just doesn't really turn that much on how people happen to speak or think. I just don't. So
let me ask you this.
I think that's the key problem.
I mean, I would agree. I don't know. I could probably guess and be wrong or right. I don't know what my guess would be, but let's say you probably, I would, do you think capitalism is a good thing or a bad thing? Look,
I'm not going to get into that.
Okay, you're not going to get into that. Let's imagine that somebody was like, yeah, capitalism is a great thing. Let's imagine that somebody says capitalism is a bad thing, but most people in the world probably would say that it's a good thing. And so just the evidence of that is not going to sway you one way or the other. You're going to think, well, that's probably not good evidence that it's a bad view. So you can think this with respect to any. That's just one bad example.
Yeah. So, I mean, in some cases, there might be some differences there, because in that case, it might be you're extrapolating from most people's judgments about whether something is good or bad. And I think what defenders of semantic theses would say is there's a big difference here, which is that, like, at least if we're focusing on the English language, all native speakers of the English language that are competent are good at using everyday moral language. And so whereas the typical person is not knowledgeable or well equipped to assess the merits of capitalism, they are well equipped to reflect on and assess how they're using moral language, because they're competent users of moral language. And so while they may make mistakes, generally speaking, they're going to be pretty good judges of how they're using moral language. That sounds plausible, but I think it turns out that it's not true. And I think it's similar to how we don't actually do a very, like, if you ask people to judge the grammaticality of sentences in a language they're a native speaker in, they're good at it. You could say, is this grammatical or not? Nope. Nope. Ask them, what specific grammatical rule is it violating? And they're going to go, I don't know. I mean, unless they have a degree in English or they're very educated,
of course,
we can use the rules of language, but we don't know the rules of language. We can't, no, we don't know is ambiguous. In a certain sense, we know them. We can use the rules of language, but we can't express or articulate the rules of our language very well. And it could be the same thing with metaethics. And so you could think people do have this implicit metaethical competency, and it's just hard to get it out of people. I do think that's a possibility. I don't think it's the case in practice.
Right. Have you seen the study done by Christian Smith, the National Youth Survey on Religion? It also surveyed not just religious beliefs, but ethical beliefs. It's really quite fascinating.
I don't know.
It's a sociological study. He's at Notre Dame, and they have a website for it. Go take a look at it. It's really quite fascinating. There's been a couple of op-eds done on this, and New York Times and other places. And I'll send you a couple pieces if you want. But it's
I'd love to check it out.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating because they find that, of course, there's a study, and it's a really great study because it's longitudinal, it's random, so on and so forth, and they adjust for oversampling of, like, so they'll do it in bilingual, and so it's actually a really good study overall, and they've got great sample sizes and so on. It's one of the best studies ever done on this sort of view. It's a little bit outdated now; it's about 10 years outdated, but it shows that there's tons of findings with respect to religious views. With respect to the moral views, it's that most people are, of course, as you said, unable to articulate what it is that they're trying to say morally. So they lack articulation, they lack the vocabulary and the concepts. And but in addition to that, they're sort of just almost willfully averse to, like, taking a stance on things. And I don't know if that comes from, like, a relativistic, let's say folk relativistic view, like, oh, I just don't want to be judgmental or something like that, right? But they don't seem all that well informed, and so this would be, to add to what, and it'd be a good segue to what we just left off of. This would be an example of, you have a population of people. Again, this is young people, but a population of people who don't really know how to use moral language or to articulate what they're saying, or they just seem like really, really, and of course, you can look at the instruments yourself, but the interviewers and so on, they're going to be making these judgments saying, well, this person was really bad at using moral language. Of course, there's some, implication there that the interviewers are good at making it and so on. But anyway, it's quite interesting. Take a look at it.
Okay, I will do that. Yeah. I think we have to wrap up here. I feel like we have so much more territory to explore.
There's a lot. We didn't even get into a ton of stuff. So I would love to do this another time with you. That'd be great.
Yeah, let's pick it up again. I know that we ended up. You asked, so I laid out my view on the matter.
I'm so glad. And this just demonstrates that, like, when doing philosophy, when doing anything, I think. It's not just a one-off, like, it's a conversation. It's like a continual, like, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? And so hopefully we're making it a more warm and inviting, more adaptable thing to that sort of, I think it's more conducive to learning, and I'm certainly learning a lot, and I hope that whoever watches this video is learning a lot too.
Yeah, well, I couldn't express how much I agree with that sentiment. You know, I find it a lot of these philosophical discussions that you see online. You'll see a blog exchange, it's 1 or 2 articles. You'll see a video, people talk for an hour. And I feel like, you know, philosophy is the kind of topic where, you know, okay, so I used to have a roommate where for us to really understand one another's views, it was conversation. They were in the same graduate program in philosophy as me. 100, 200, 300 conversations before, you know, and until we really had a good working model of one another's views. And I think that is where, so for me, at least personally, so much philosophical progress came from conversations rather than just reading articles.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me let you go. I'm going to go and think about this and rewatch the video when I repost it. But this has been wonderful. Let's do it again soon.
Yeah, let's do it again. And the last thing I'll say about that is I noticed you have this good method of splitting things up into more digestible chunks. So I think we should work out how to do that, because I just hit people with 4-hour videos. I don't think I should do that.
It's not the best way to do it. You got to have the right software, but I just changed software, so I'm not sure how to do it properly. But we can talk about that too. So,
yeah, we'll figure that out.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much for talking. We'll do it again.
All right.
Take care.